welcome. We are at the 5th Design Justice Network member story sharing session. Today we have Jorn Bettin, who is joining us from New Zealand. I will introduce him in just a moment. As a quick reminder, these are Design Justice members story sharing sessions where members share a little bit about themselves, about the work that they're doing, and its connection to design justice or the network or the different social movements folks are involved in. For myself, my name's Victoria. I am a part-time staff for the Design Justice Network, and I'm joining you from Toronto, Ontario, which is the land and territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabeg, Mississaugas of the First Credit Nation, Mississauga, Huron-Wendat, and many other different Native groups. Sorry, I've lost my words. And so I'm joining you from there, and I welcome everybody to introduce themselves in the chat. Let us know where you're calling or joining us from today. And now I've pasted into the chat the session outline so that you can follow along with what we're going to do. And I will welcome in Jorn Bettin. And if there is anyone in the group that would like to support by taking any notes or screenshots, everything's there in the session outline for you to follow, and feel free to go ahead. So now I'm going to welcome in Jorn. So Jorn Bettin is an autistic anthropologist by birth and a knowledge archaeologist by autodidactic training. He has a background in mathematics and has put his understanding of formal symbolic reasoning to good use in the co-design of ecosystems of visual domain-specific languages, working closely with domain experts from a broad range of industries in transdisciplinary context. Jorn has been involved in operating S23M since 2002. His current work focuses on the co-design of new community-oriented and patient-centric models of care, including supporting software tools. Jorn has also co-authored a number of books on creative collaboration and model-driven product line engineering, and he is part of the Autistic Collaboration Trust, a global mutual support hub for neurodivergent individuals and ventures. So I'm very happy to welcome in Jorn, and Jorn will now lead us in a presentation for about 10 minutes, and then later we'll move into some breakout rooms. So I will pass the mic now to Jorn, and we'll monitor the chat.
Thank you, Victoria, for the introduction. So I'll try to keep this brief, and the slides here contain a few more than I'll actually present, but I thought they will be useful for you later as backdrop, or if you want to click on some of the links. So I want to focus here on one aspect of the work that I'm involved in, which is about, I stated here as making the world a safer place for everyone. So the backdrop for this is the pathology paradigm that relates to most forms of neurodivergence today, including autistic people. I deeply care about this as an autistic person, and this directly relates to one of the Design Justice Network principles, obviously. So we want to really center the voices of those who are directly impacted. So how does this pathology paradigm play out in the life of autistic people? Well, for one, there is this busyness opportunity related to autistic children, which become part of our indoctrination factories, also known as schools and universities. That sadly has become a multi-billion-dollar industry, but it doesn't stop there. There's the other busyness opportunity, that's the systematic exploitation of autistic people in the workplace. There is no shortage of corporations who have jumped on this bandwagon. So what's happened over the years is the level of awareness about neurodiversity has drastically gone up. But the level of appreciation of autistic people actually has gone down, and corporations are now co-opting the neurodiversity movement. That's in full swing, so we see all this exploitation. And that leads directly to the need for short-range tools for survival, in particular for neurodivergent people and autistic people. So that's the motivation, it's the backdrop. And so what kind of tools can we create and to that effect? So within the autistic community, we've come up with two service designs that are useful in this context. And I will just skim over this now because on the I think Design Justice Network website, you've already seen the article where I outline these services. So on the one hand side, there's an employer psychological safety rating, which is a service that employers can subscribe to. And by subscribing, what they are committing to is community-powered independent oversight of psychological safety in their workplace. And this is a collaboration that I'm keen to expand with the Design Justice Network because it's not only about autistic people here. I think everyone is exploited within our economic system. So it's about psychological safety for all staff, for everyone who needs to commodify themselves in order to survive in this world. So I invite anyone who is interested in contributing as a peer to this community-powered independent oversight process to get in touch, and I think we can create very effective services of this type globally in all geographies and regions. So just last week, we had a first customer for this service sign up from the US. So, and I'm actively looking for people to support us.
Jorn,
so that we have an intersectional group of peers that can support this. Yes, Victoria?
Oh, quick question. Did you want to share some slides? I know you had some, so I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah. Well, I'm going through these slides here. So the related service is the bullying alert service. So these regular surveys via the employer rating service, that's one service that is useful, providing useful data to employers, to employees when the data is shared. And if employers can then choose whether to publicize this data or not. But to complement this, there's also a community-powered bullying alert service that allows employees to contact peers from their own marginalized minority group that are outside the organization that can then get in touch with the employer and, as needed, anonymize the entire situation. So that's all work that's in progress. It's starting to look really interesting, and I'm keen to scale this up.
Jorn, so, one more thing. You just have to click the share screen button.
All right. Well, there we go. Now, so I thought you had.
There you go. No, my fault. Sorry. There you go.
Let's see, where is all the rest gone? Now, Zoom has rearranged everything again, but we're back in business. Okay, so we were here. This that's the other slide, bullying alert service. But let's just skim over this. So what do we have here? Yeah, so this is really about engaging with the wider neurodiversity movement and other marginalized groups to catalyze trustworthy and globally accessible services that are administered by volunteers from marginalized groups. the Autistic Collaboration Trust can also offer relevant software tools and assist in establishing these intersectional teams of volunteers. And yeah, so here's a URL. So you're invited to join us in this effort. I think this would be a great collaboration with the Design Justice Network. Geographically, yeah, I'm based here in New Zealand, so but time zone wise, we can still collaborate with people in other parts of the world. So keen to hear from you. Now, the core of what I wanted to talk about today, though, is sort of mid-range tools for healthier lives, because as you can imagine, this employer rating service and this bullying alert service, yeah, you want to have that in place, in particular for larger organizations that actually are not that safe, right? As basically those are, well, short-range life-saving tools. But ultimately, we want to, I think, find ways of incrementally, really significantly changing the way we live. And this is now getting to the commercial work that I'm doing with S23M, which I co-founded nearly 20 years ago. And our tagline there is enabling knowledge to flow to all the places where it can be put to good use. And all our work, I think, relates very much to this idea that the role of the designer is a facilitator rather than an expert. The baseline service that we provide, we call that creative collaboration, which consists of a number of different parts. So an important part there are open space workshops on a regular basis. That create a continuous knowledge creation spiral to break through all these barriers of established disciplines, management structures, groupthink, and as needed physical distance. And what we do is we look out for psychological safety in these. By this mechanism, we basically provide kind of like training wheels to larger organizations in terms of psychological safety. And then once you've got pockets of psychological safety that you can work with, then we can engage deeply with domain experts from various disciplines to conduct so-called model-oriented domain analysis workshops, where you basically take the psychological safety as a given. You've got a really small group of people there, and there you can then very rapidly make significant progress and develop new services, tools, and this is work that I enjoy immensely alongside the open space workshops. And then lastly, once initiatives are underway, then you can also have these regular solution validation workshops or steering workshops where basically you have democratic governance of programs of work. And that is the way that we engage with communities, in particular in the healthcare sector. Now, this service, how do we support this? I mean, via my work, I've discovered that language is the most powerful tool at our disposal. So over the years, I've blacklisted many terms that are commonly used at work, so they don't exist in my world of work. And it's by introducing people to a new language and then consistently using it and reminding people that this is what the organization is supposed to be doing, that's, I think, incrementally, slowly change in a positive direction can take place. So just some examples here. So I talk about care rather than commodification. So we want to co-create ecologies of care instead of economies of commodified goods. The whole notion of leaders and leadership, I don't subscribe to that. Those words don't exist in my vocabulary. I only use them in double quotes. So I'm much more comfortable, talking about catalysts or to grow competency networks, to get things done and to distribute decision-making to where the knowledge resides. We coordinate rather than manage. We replace fear with courage. We provide a space for creative collaboration and divergent thinking rather than insisting on best practices. We value the currency of knowledge rather than the liquidity of money. We co-create these ecologies of care rather than economies, right? So it's via these subtle shifts in language. If you do that consistently, you really can communicate very strongly what your actual intent is. And by not only shifting one or two words, but by having a whole language system of words that you're changing, it makes it harder for corporations to co-opt these things. So for example, a term like neurodiversity, it's just one word that can very easily be co-opted. But this entire language system here is harder to co-opt. So you can offer your gifts to the world instead of coming up with new ways of seeking rent. Well, I talk about creating good company rather than busyness, right? Because we want to focus on the people and the things we care about rather than what's just keeping us busy. What's very important is scale as well. So I appreciate human scale and individual agency rather than large scale and growth. Then I prefer talking about learning about each other instead of perpetuating a fictional notion of normality. And this notion of competition is, of course, completely toxic. So it's much more constructive to think about niche construction and symbiosis, which is how things actually play out in complex adaptive systems. This direct competition is a bizarre construction of the ideology that we're embedded in. We create open source communities instead of walled gardens of intellectual property. We pay attention to physical waste rather than wealth to focus on metrics that actually matter. And instead of profit, I prefer to repair frayed relationships. We talked about symbiosis already. We share valuable tacit knowledge in good company to raise collective intelligence. So we don't subscribe to this fiction of meritocracy. We value the transparency of information rather than the liquidity of money. Visibly and extending trust is really important. So that is the opposite of creating weaponized contracts. I think the current euphemism probably in some cases will be the so-called smart contracts. And it's important to think in terms of values rather than value to avoid discounting what's priceless. And that's, I think, it in a nutshell. To close off, just an outlook here. So we also have long-range tools for cultural evolution. I'll skim over this. So on the one hand side, there's the Autistic Collaboration Trust, which collaborates with various other organizations. And that's really a mutual support hub where we create long-term collaborations and even new organizations, which I like to refer to as neurodivergent. So those are inclusive, non-hierarchical organizations operated by neurodivergent people and those organizations provide a safe and nurturing environment for divergent thinking, creativity, exploration, and collaborative niche construction. And you can think of these neurodivergents really as islands of sanity. So it's like the emperor penguins. Only a few at any point in time need to brace the sort of the outside world, and you can within a neurodivergent you create these safe spaces that make life much more livable. What I like to remind people of, as well as these pro-social core design principles that come out of the work of Elinor Ostrom, who was an economist that got the Nobel Prize for her work on the management of shared resources. So that's very interesting work. Yeah, that's really it. This book here on collaboration at human scale is, I think, something that we can cover in another session. So now keen to engage and learn about what you're doing, because I've watched several of these other sessions and I think been part of one or two. And that's always a very interesting part. Keen to learn.
So great. Thank you, Jorn, for sharing. For everybody, I put actually the link to the slides right into the notes section, so you can take a look, because there's lots of information in there, and I'm sure you'll want to be able to follow up. But so now what we're going to do is go into smaller breakout rooms, just of 3 or 4 people. And what we've been doing in previous sessions, I know some of you have seen this before, but what we've been doing is going into those smaller breakout rooms. We can use or not use a Google Jamboard to keep track of some notes, but it's basically a session to go into the breakout room to kind of just talk about what we just learned or experienced with Jorn, and think about any questions that you might want to ask him. So I'm going to do a very quick screen share of the Google Jamboard, which I did just post into the chat for everybody. And I'll just show you quickly how to use it. So if you want to use it, the questions are here. Just basically go in, introduce yourselves, discuss what we talked or what Jorn talked about, anything unique or challenging, anything you're interested in exploring, or any questions that you'd like to ask. And I'll show you quickly. So the way to use the Jamboard, click that link that I put in the chat. Click on, for example, a sticky note. You can add notes in there, and it will show up on the Google Jamboard right in front of you. There's also a text tool. Is it this one? Nope. Nope. Oh, here it is, text tool. So you can just, yay. So is everyone back? Looks like it. Okay, welcome back, everyone. As a quick reminder, we're still recording. And now is time for the fun part where we get to ask Jorn some questions. I will first put a call out to say, if anyone would like to start by just calling out or saying out loud your question, feel free to unmute yourself and say your question. If not, I'm keeping track of the chat as well as the questions doc, and I will read them out. So is anyone interested, or is anyone wanting to ask a question?
So really quickly, this is Sheldon. So Jorn, I believe I heard you earlier mentioning something about a kind of like review board or something of that nature that you were encouraging folks to take advantage of. Did I mishear that? I know I was kind of moving around a little bit, but I believe that you had mentioned something like that. If so, I'd love to hear more about it, because as you just heard, with Takano, a big part of what I want to be able to do is to leverage folks who have more experience and, knowledge and skills around, different elements of inclusivity and equity that maybe I'm not familiar with, right? And so how do I leverage those folks to be able to make sure that whatever tech I'm building, introducing to the world, kind of has had a good set of eyes that looked at it?
So what I mentioned was this psychological safety rating service, which is community powered. So this is about assembling an intersectional group of volunteers that supervises regular psychological safety surveys, which are entirely anonymous. So we've got the tools to run these surveys, and the results are then presented back to the employer in an anonymous form. What's as part of this process, that the volunteers can get involved in doing some spot checks to ensure that the employer is not manufacturing survey responses on behalf of employees, right? So there are some elements that are best left to humans. The other very important human aspect to this is the bullying alert service. So the employer rating service, what it can do is it can communicate both to the employer and to staff certain abstract metrics, how safe are people feeling with their peers? How safe are they feeling with their superiors in these bizarre pyramid schemes, right? I mean, the thing is, remember, these tools are life-saving tools. These are not the mid-range and long-range tool where we can create egalitarian organizations, right? So it's just allowing people to survive. So that's why we still have questions there regarding, how do you get on with your superiors? Then, of course, you have these different dimensions of diversity. Whether you've got neurodivergent staff, then people have different ethnic and cultural backgrounds. Some may identify as disabled. We've got all the gender non-conformant people, right? You can create very simple metrics that tell the organization and everyone in the organization how they're doing. And to have this, I think, monitored from the outside makes it very credible. It's entirely different as if this would be something, let's say, that's run by an HR department, right? I mean, if it's run internally by HR, you never get to, well, why would you be honest, right? I mean, it must, in order to have any credibility, this must be external, and that's, I think, where the power is. And there's always going to be this human element. But having said that, in terms of technology, for example, I think there's room to think creatively about how to best assemble these regional, say, intersectional groups of volunteers, right? So to allow them to collaborate effectively. What I also want to encourage is, if you have this type of service, for example, the bullying alert service, people, I think, should be, if there's, say, someone's using the service, then the peers that then ultimately take on the service, I mean, you coordinate who picks this up. And then I would recommend to actually do this in buddy pairs so that people can consult between each other. That's, more than one person, because you're dealing with very difficult issues that can be potentially even, a matter of life and death for the person who is in a really bad spot.
Thank you, Jorn. Does anyone have a follow-up or a new question? Okay, I'm gonna read some from, Sybil, did you want to go, or Sybil?
Yeah, Sybil, sorry, I'm terribly sorry I missed your presentation, and I'm gonna have to catch up on it later, but I am looking at your slides, so and it's super interesting to me, and I don't know if this was addressed in your talk, and if it was, then it's okay. You can just say, I already talked about that, watch the video. But I'm intrigued by this idea of exploitation of folks, of neurodivergent folks, and whether that's intentional. And so if it is intentional, because in fact people brag about the capacity of neurodivergent folks, is this solution that you're proposing, this sufficient to address something that is actually not only possibly intentional within an organization, but actually being shared as a strategy between organizations to also intentionally, like, hey, this is a strategy you can do. You can bring on all these people and have them work really, really hard for you, and all they need is peanuts,
Yeah. This is exactly what's going on. I mean, you've got these, I don't know whether you've heard of these programs that are run by multiple big corporations. I don't even need to mention the names. You'll all know the names. They run these programs that they like to call autism at work or neurodiversity at work, right? Just imagine having a diversity and inclusion initiative labeled Women at Work, right? I mean, they can sort of see where this is coming from. It's quite bizarre, and it's exactly as you say. It's systematic exploitation, and the only way that we can push back against this is by a combination, by a multi-pronged approach where we have short-term survival tools, tools for incrementally educating the wider population and replacing some of the fear that paralyzes people with courage, and then long-term tools, equipping people with the ways to create worker-owned cooperatives and so forth, and that, you know, where we don't have these pyramid schemes, where we don't have this profit orientation and so forth. And I mean, the entire economic ideology that we're running is completely suicidal, right? So and hardly anyone even talks about this what I call paradigmatic inertia. So that's more than cultural inertia. It's when paradigmatic inertia, I define this when any sort of change is limited to, change within established institutional structures, not realizing that actually the whole network of institutions itself can be entirely exploitative and corrupt to the point where unless you replace some of those institutions, you're not going to get anywhere. And tragically, I think civilizations tend to evolve always by adding further institutions. So yeah, we do see this, but where do you ever see institutions entirely decommissioned? I mean, that's, we need to get less complex.
So just sorry, as a quick follow-up to that, if that's okay, the employment of folks with intellectual disabilities, which has been banned in some places of like underpayment and such, whether this is kind of like a sort of higher class version of in some ways the same bullshit. The way that, for example, the precarity of academic workers has become parallel in some ways to the precarity of like domestic workers. Is there anything that can be done in the way of sort of reframing it such that, because people know that it's super problematic the way that folks with intellectual disabilities have been treated? Is there a way like paralleling that?
Yeah, this is, if you look at what I said in my presentation or in the slides, this is, I think, why the language is so important. So I think if we collectively just simply refuse to go along with the language of the establishment, I think that's where the power lies, because then in every sentence we say, we are able to communicate dissent and divergence. And this then is, I think, that's the power lies not in educating all the other highly sensitive, marginalized, neurodivergent, and otherwise marginalized people. The power lies in resensitizing the numbed majority of neuronormative people, which are so pliable that they just go along with the flow. So they need to get these alternative signals.
A related question, I'll paste it in the chat as well, but a related question that some folks asked was the rediscovering language, the slides that you were showing. Question part one is, are you connected with others trying to shift language and terminology? And then the second part is, that, yes, I'm really appreciating the rediscovering language work, and what was your process for developing the language that you use, and has it evolved over time?
Yeah, well, certainly this is something that's evolved over time, but it's the result of, well, experiencing our economic ideology in practice for over 30 years. And I guess but all along, I mean, I started out 30 years ago in the development of data and software intensive product development, at the boundary between the people who were wanting to develop certain services and products and those who then actually implemented them. So it was always, at the specification level, understanding both the intent, the commercial intent, and then mapping that to implementation technologies. So I worked in all kinds of industries, from insurance, manufacturing, and then in big tech companies. I did a contract once in the, I didn't want to do this, but yeah, I had to do a contract once in the financial sector as well. So I've seen all industries, and throughout, what I noticed is that the language of, this became very, very apparent, the language of busyness is entirely toxic. And when you get involved in these specifications, you notice what the intent is, right? Because if you're the designer or involved in the design, yeah, you have to ask the questions, and people tell you what kind of profit they make, right? They tell you, we're doing this because we need to subsidize that, right? And these are things that you are not taught at any university, but that's daily business that corporations use. So I opted out of that world 20 years ago because I would have died in that world.
Thank you, Jorn.
Let's see, did I ask all the questions? Answer the question?
I think so.
Yes, there are others as well. So yeah, we are
there's a few
fairly
more.
small team, and it's effectively in my work as part of this design work. I was always developing these domain-specific language systems, these technologies, and we've even developed because I was doing this on a regular basis, I've developed a meta language system that allows me to formally specify language systems. And this meta language system is really interesting because it's consciously designed to be ideology neutral. It's at this level where the meta concepts, they are just core aspects of human cognition, biology, right? The way our perceptive mechanisms work. So those things can't be fudged. And then the instantiations of these things, those are then the language systems that we can design and create and document and reason about. It's important that we visualize these things at that level of language design, and become conscious of all the things that can be done with these concepts that we create, so that we can extrapolate in advance, what's likely to happen in terms of co-opting and so forth.
Jorn, there's quite a few more questions left, but we're almost at the top of the hour. Are you okay to stay on maybe for another 5 minutes?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and if everyone else, if you're able to stay on, great. I want to make sure we can get the questions answered. But sorry about the time constraints. It's just such a very important topic that there's lots to talk about. So I'm pasting the next question into the chat for everybody. The next one is, I really liked the emperor penguin analogy. How do you consider incorporating healing into your work for neurodivergent people who feel pain or trauma from allistic interactions?
Mm-hmm. Well, that relates directly to these services that we are offering. So this creative collaboration service, when we introduce this, we always precede this with an educational session where we explain the entire neurodiversity paradigm via the social model of disability, where we explain psychological safety or the lack of it and how it plays out in organizations. And often that's the first time, you know, in large organizations that people hear about this topic in this sort of unvarnished form. And that's, people, that gets to people, and quite a number of people then do find the courage to, well, speak up, and then they are very excited about the possibility of having open space workshops facilitated by neurodivergent facilitators. So that's like the first baby step. In the longer term, but that's also already happening now. I mean, I'm encouraging neurodivergent people to form worker cooperatives. So I think the learning process that happens via the commercial creative collaboration process or service is twofold. On the one hand side, there is this collective learning within the organization where perhaps some groups or teams will find their way back to more collaborative ways of working. But there's also the individual learning that takes place. So it may well be that the wider organizational context is so toxic that, you know, you can't expect any genuine transformation. But then what you've done with the education is you've equipped people with the basic tools and perhaps with a little bit of courage needed for them to exit this toxic suicidal environment. And you can then work with those people to equip them with tools so that they can create, say, worker cooperatives, and then use this emperor penguin model to engage with the rest of the world. And this could even be, you know, a group of people exiting a toxic organization, doing their own thing, and then offering their services from the outside back to the organization, right?
Thank you. There are 3 more questions, so I'll paste it into the chat for the next one. How may we rediscover the language of disability to acknowledge neurodiversity? Autism seems to be a super ability rather than a disability.
Well, I think every ability is at the same time also a disability. And what I find within the autistic community, and I'm not sure how far this is known beyond the autistic community, but my experience is that autistic people are very, very bad at maintaining hidden agendas. And this also means that we are very, very bad at self-promotion at an individual level. And I think this explains why autistic people are so marginalized. I mean, we speak up, we speak out, even if it's going to sort of kill us in the workplace. And the same, I think, applies to any disability. For example, it's even in biology, disability drives evolution. So, and this should be appreciated, and that's why all disabled people deserve appropriate accommodation and support. So, for example, if you've got, say, in biology, if you've got fish that don't have good eyesight, well, those via some mutation, right? I mean, that may enable them to develop other sensory modalities and then survive in places where there's no light at all, right? So, and the same goes with humans. I mean, we know blind people, they develop their other senses. And so who's to say that blindness needs to be a disability. You can frame this all via the social model, but the environment needs to be supportive. I mean, people need to understand that no human is entirely independent. We're all highly interdependent, right? But our particular society has created a fictional type of interdependence where if you don't have any level of compassion, if you have no scruples in exploiting other people, then you can claim to, then apparently you can be so-called independent in our society, but only in this bizarre financial sense, I mean, which doesn't make sense at all to me.
Thank you, Jorn. Also, if there's comments on what's being talked about, feel free to jump in. I forgot. I keep trying to push it to the next question, but feel free to share any thoughts. The next question is actually kind of related to things that we can do together, whether as a network. And so I'll read it. It says, how do we connect with you further or start to talk about this within the network? What are some ideas of ways you'd like to see engagement happen? And then Wes in the chat also said, overall, this talk is making so many things I've not been able to articulate before a lot clearer. And I wonder how sustained strategies within and connected to the network could make this transformation happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think, Victoria, this relates to some of the things that we've already talked about. So on the one hand side, I think there is, and to some extent, we see some of that, I think, emerging on Slack, but and in terms of some of the activities that the network is doing. But I think on the one hand side, there can be certain topics of interest like healthcare, and we can form collaborations around these interests, that relate to our professional work. So let's call that domain-specific groups. And the other is, of course, regional groups like we are having, where I'm really keen to expand the network here in our region, well, loosely speaking, Oceania, and we can, from New Zealand, be a bit of a bridge here between Asia and the Americas, I think, time zone-wise. So I'm open at both ends. Knowledge sharing, right? Getting knowledge to flow to the places where it can be put to good use. This is what I do on a daily basis. So I welcome all ways of collaboration. The way to do this is, I've got a personal blog, then S2FRM, we've got a website. Then there is the Autistic Collaboration Trust. So if you relate to neurodiversity and autism in particular, there's a whole community there that's tied into the wider autistic community. Another great community around autistic people is neuroclastic.com. So that's a website operated by Tara Vance in the US. It's a growing collective, I think over 300 autistic writers. And there's a fantastic trove of knowledge on that side. In terms of knowledge sharing, you may also find a lot of useful information on the Autistic Collaboration Trust website. And on my personal blog, I tend to post things that, I'm not sure whether, that's relevant to everyone in the autistic community. So that's more sort of, covers other topics. And practical collaboration, well, let's try and make good use here of the Design Justice Network. So I'm keen to bring, in particular, people from our geography into the network, and to encourage people, no matter where they are, who are doing work in the healthcare domain, to step forward. So the bigger theme here is to create healthy communities. And I'm also in the process of establishing a strong partnership with an organization called Local Futures. I don't know whether you've heard of this before. So that's an organization, they've been active for nearly 40 years, or around about 40 years, in the space of localization, so opposing the forces of globalization. And they are focusing on relocalizing food production and shortening supply chains, which is, I think, a very interesting aspect of what needs to happen that complements the work that we are doing in healthcare with, well, with indigenous communities and with traditional healthcare delivery organizations like hospitals.
I'm also thinking as another thing, there's still one more question, but as one potential kind of takeaway for folks who are here in the room is when I send the email out to say thank you and here are the notes and the video, maybe what we could do is create a Slack channel within the network already. I don't know what the proper title would be, like neurodivergent or autistic collaboration or something like that. But maybe you and I could chat quickly after and decide, okay, here's a good name. And then we'll invite people to join that after the session within that email. Does that sound like, would folks be interested in that if who are on the call? Okay, we'll figure out something like that and invite people. Here is our final question, especially, and if folks have to go, feel free to go, but thank you for staying on for so long. Our final question is, the worker cooperatives bring to mind the language of democracy. Do you dissent with the established language of democracy? If so, what are empowering alternatives?
Yeah, that's another good question. I would encourage you to investigate the Autistic Collaboration Trust website and what we write there about neurodivergent forms of collaboration and the neurodiventure model, which encapsulate specific first principles that we have found useful over the years. So the established language of democracy, I mean, is our modern Western democracies are very atrophied, right? I mean, as if it's all about going to the voting machine and pressing a button every 3 or 4 years. And then also making it about people, making it about personalities. So I think it's all a personality cult. It's interesting, actually, and there are some interesting exceptions from which we can learn. So in Switzerland, for example, whilst there are many things that are wrong in that country, what's really cool about Switzerland is that they don't have a head of state. It's an elected group of, I think it's 7 or 9 members. So, and they rotate it basically, I think, on a yearly basis as to who gets to represent the country. So there are ways of creating much more interactive, direct democracies that are not much talked about. And certainly, democracy at work hardly exists. This is where the employer rating service and the bullying alert service are like very basic rudimentary steps in that direction.
Thank you so much, Jorn, for all of your responses, for the presentation, for everything today. I will throw it back to the crowd. If there's anything else anyone wants to share or say, now is the time. And what I am going to try to do is get the video up and posted by this Friday, so we can send it out to everybody with the notes and the new kind of Slack channel. And again, if you did have any feedback about today, I posted in the chat just to send us an email to let us know any new ideas or ways to change this to make them better in the future. We're totally open for any and all feedback. Really excited you are all here, and thank you again, Jorn. Everybody's quiet and saying bye.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
No.